Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. I have a guest today who is familiar to many of you. It is my advisor from when I was a grad student at Cornell University. Welcome to the show, Dr. Frank Rossi.
It's great to be here, Micah. Glad to see you wearing the big red shirt. Really, always great to spend some time with you, have a chat. Always like those old Friday afternoons 20 years ago.
Yeah, it sure seems like it wasn't that long ago. But yeah, time passes and we all grow up.
Yeah,
So,
you ain't kidding.
so for those of you who don't know, Frank Rossi is the New York State Extension turfgrass specialist at Cornell University, and he is a turfgrass expert who you did your training with weeds and ecology. Isn't that what you got started out with?
Yeah, I got started out with when I went back to grad school after a couple of years working as an assistant and then run a little 9-hole place. When I went back for my master's, I studied under Dick Scogli, who was he would describe himself as a plant selector, right? And that's where I bumped into the Rothamsted experiment, right? The last conversation I think we had about some of your your worst experiment that you did with me, but yours and my collective favorite experiment that we loved in Rothamsted, right? So I started out that way, low input, walking around cemeteries with Scogli, walking around his plots, working with a grass, trying to develop it as a low input turf grass. But I think actually what set the stage for my next career was my interaction. My next step was my interaction with John Jagschitz, the weed scientist at URI, who then recommended me for a position that Joe Neal was looking for. Joe was a weed scientist at Cornell at the time. And I came and studied weed science here from 87 to 90. And then I left and became an environmental specialist. But yeah, my minor was in plant anatomy. I did a soil physics minor for my master's degree.
Yes, so you have a wide range of training and you have a wide range of interests and
like
and
you.
like me, you're also an accomplished podcaster with the Frankly Speaking podcast on TurfNet Radio, and I enjoyed listening to your episode recently with Dr. Brandon Horvath from the University of Tennessee. And you had a good discussion with him about mentors and his going to graduate school where his advisor was Dr. Joe Vargas. And Brandon had some really interesting things to say about what it was like to have him as an advisor and then to get your Ph.D. and finish your education at the university to up to the point where you get a PhD. We always continue learning. We always continue our education. And then suddenly you're the peer of that person, but they're still a mentor. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to ask you, because now we're kind of peers, but you're still my mentor. I'm teaching a seminar for the first time ever at the upcoming GCSAA conference in San Diego. And I want to ask you as a mentor, what advice do you give to me to speak to an audience who I understand some of the mainstream ways that people manage is so different from the ways that I'm thinking of. So I have a little bit of trepidation of what if some of the people in there have no idea about this? How do I best prepare to speak to that kind of audience? Or because you've done that before.
Yeah, I've done that a few times. What's your topic? What are you talking about?
I'm harmonizing growth, performance, and nutrition. So
Right.
it's a 4-hour seminar. It's a half-day seminar, and I get a chance to talk about surface performance, which is the end goal. So we start with how do we produce the surface performance? How do we make sure that we are producing that? And then look at especially managing growth to produce that, and to have healthy grass, we need to have the right nutrients. So it's managing growth, organic matter, and nutrients to produce the surface. So I get to talk about all my stuff.
Yeah. This is your lane, right? I mean, this is the lane that you've, carved out and paved very successfully. And, it's so if the question is, how do you spend 4 hours talking to people that it's possible that they may not be able to take in what you're saying? What I used to do in my early years of teaching was I would always carve out about like 10 to 15 minutes of a like I would talk and then I would pose a hypothetical question and they would sit at round tables. I would make sure my class was oriented around round tables, which drove some of the GCSA people crazy because they want to, do classroom because you get more people in the room. So I did round tables to facilitate some conversation, and then what I would have each group do would be report out. And one of the things that fundamentally does is it provides you more insight into where they're at, and then you have a better chance to meet them where they're at, right? Versus you, like I often do, pontificating about the sage way we believe that any sane person would manage a putting surface, which means sort of measure and monitor and adjust and adapt. And yet, you and I are confronted with oftentimes people that really want to remove the thinking from this particular aspect of their professional life, and just do whatever's worked in the past, and no one's complaining, and I can get away with it, and it doesn't cost me anything that I can't afford, and so I just keep doing it. So I think some interaction with them has a way of fleshing some of that out, and also confronting, as you and I know, the dogma that exists out there.
Yeah, because people will often have the question if for example it was only a nutrition talk, then one of the questions that comes up, well, what about nutrients that are present but aren't available, right? So
Here we
you can
go.
it's better to bring that instead of letting that be at the very end of the seminar and you realize, wait, there's been people in the audience that have been sitting there with that question. So they've been doubting everything I've said for the entire time because they think I'm talking about something that actually the nutrients aren't available. And it's better to bring that question up at the start. So if you
You
can,
know,
so you're suggesting to prompt asking questions, asking hypothetical. Did you say hypothetical questions or
yes.
something related to what
Hypothetical
we've
or
discussed?
case studies, hypothetical questions. You're a superintendent in this part of the world, and force people. Listen, one of the great things at the national is that it's international. You get people from all over the world come in, right? And as somebody like you're going to have an international audience there. So I would encourage you to not necessarily worry about a U.S. centric or an American centric approach to golf course management, which I know, you can and not, you can go both ways, but you sort of recognize that there is a way that Americans go about doing things and the way the rest of the world sort of goes about doing things. And that's not to say there's not blends in different places that you're probably exploring now with Turf Without Borders. How's that thing going?
It's going good. Podcast scheduling and doing this kind of thing is a hobby, a fun hobby. But I've done one excellent episode with John Wood from St. Andrews. I really wanted to kick off from the home of golf. That was great. It's gotten really good reviews from the people who have listened, and I haven't scheduled any more episodes to record, but I have some really interesting places around the world and interesting people to talk with around the world that are in my mind. But I haven't contacted them to say, hey, can you be the next guest on the show?
Right.
That's fun because it's so interesting to look at how turf is managed around the world, because you find sometimes I'm surprised because I am working around the world, talking with people around the world, and sometimes it hits me in the face some of the strange things about the way turf is managed in the US. And I want to bring up, because this is the ATC double cut, let's bring up a particular post. I'll put it up on the screen for those watching, for those listening.
And let me give you one more tip while you
Yeah.
do that. What I found, and this is a nice way, I think, for you to get feedback from your audience in the seminar is make sure everybody has internet connection and get a Poll Everywhere account or get some sort of interactive device that you can use, like questions you might ask somebody that could be a word cloud. Like, how do you decide how much top dressing? And maybe you say measure, there's lots of ways to get feedback using those interactive things. And I think, again, it fleshes out the people who are skeptics in the audience, who are like, who the hell is this guy? Which, of course, I got in my career, especially with the topic we're about to discuss around potassium. I stopped getting invited to certain places because of the things we were doing back in your graduate school days. Yeah. So, I'm not unfamiliar to having to confront these things, but at the same time, I really like a challenging learning environment. I'm actually very worried as an academic, the sort of way the academy is starting to cater to intellectual safety versus intellectual challenging. I want a challenging intellectual environment. I just don't think you come to college or go to a seminar to be intellectually safe. If you want to be intellectually safe, stay home and read a book, or stay home and watch some news program that makes you feel safe, or feel terrified, whichever you prefer to be. But I believe in a learning environment should be challenging, a bit uncomfortable. And I don't think a lot of people in today's world are necessarily comfortable with being uncomfortable in a learning environment. They want to feel like they've achieved a certain position and that they know what they're doing, and questioning it is a fool's errand.
That is good insight. And yeah, I think for my seminars, the way that I tend to do it, we're always talking about something new. And it's things, one thing that I've found is I often haven't done those things or thought in this way in the past myself either, because I continue learning. And then, I went into that potassium study that I did with you, fully expecting that we were going to find the optimum potassium rate, because I thought, well, of course you need some potassium. Let's figure out how much. Maybe it's the same amount as nitrogen. Maybe it's a little bit more because it's a sand root zone. It's high calcium. The potassium will be less available. And it turned out the best results were with no potassium for years. And that surprised me. Then I learned, then I update my understanding, and then I can share that. And whether it's clipping volume or OM246 or the frequency of top dressing or the annual nitrogen rates that I recommend, a lot of things are new. Mm-hmm. So I can sort of empathize with people in the audience. I do want to make it a challenging intellectual experience, and let's make sure that we learn a lot, or at least have our memories peaked a little bit to be intrigued, to want to learn more about this, or to consider maybe next year, maybe the year after, maybe we could do 3 top dressing events instead of 20. And you don't have to make that change right away, but just to think about it. So I want to make it challenging. And one thing that I can try to remember is I can remember that there was a time that I thought 20 or 26 top dressing events would be ideal also. Now I don't, but 10 years ago, I used to stand up there and recommend it. So,
because 10 years ago, that's how we grew grass. We grew grass in a way that required us to use that much sand, because we had gotten scared away from low nitrogen by anthracnose or lack of wear tolerance in bent grass, although I'm not sure we understood it. I think Bill came on the scene and really changed the game with his discussion about over-regulation and the use of PGRs, because that sort of mitigated some of the over-fertilization that was probably happening at the time. And at the end of the day, I hope you're hopeful that the OM246 approach is going to at least shed some light on the way we decide, the way we want to cultivate and manage the soil physical properties of our putting surfaces. Yes?
Yes. So OM246 is the total organic material measurement at the surface of the root zone. And if you just take a single measurement, it doesn't give you a huge amount of insight. If you just take a single measurement at one point in time, it can just tell you if you're below average, average, or above average, but there's no target number. Now, some people make target numbers. I don't think that's the ideal way to go about it, because you can have really good surfaces with 3% organic material at the surface. You can also have really good surfaces with 17% organic material right at the surface.
That's exactly
and
right.
and the real value in this is the change over time, because you basically are never going to be happy with where you're at. You're always going to think, I want the surfaces to be a little bit better. And that may be that I want the surfaces to be a little bit firmer, or I may want the water to move through a little bit faster, or I may want them to hold just a little bit more water so that they don't wilt at 1 p.m. every day. And so you've got different, or maybe you're getting complaints that the surfaces are too firm and you want them to be just a little bit more receptive. Whatever it is, you always have that room for improvement. So you do work, you do cultivation. That may be solid tine, it may be hollow tine, it may be sand injection, it may be scarification. And you also apply sand top dressing, or you may say, you know what, I get smoother surfaces and better ball roll without sand on the green, so I'm going to try to minimize sand top dressing. But then you want to know, how do all these adjustments that you make in the maintenance work, how does that affect the organic material in the root zone? So the second time you test and the third time you test, looking at the work that was done in between the testing events, that's where the real insight comes in. And I saw a course in Portland, Oregon, one of the municipal courses there. They have a track record over the past 3 or 4 years where, I forget the exact number, but they went like 14%. So we're talking the OM2. They went like 14% to 11% to 8% to 5.5%. And I wrote the superintendent. I said, man, I don't know, whatever you're doing, that's like that would be very interesting information for a lot of people out there, because he just had it's a straight line down. So and I'm like, well, I sure hope you're trying to accomplish that, because whatever you're doing, it is accomplishing it.
Well, and then, and then at the end of the day, very much like you did in the development with Larry and Wendy with MLSM, was, how's your turf performing? How's it look? How's it, not just the smoothness on any given day, but are you in a range of where you want to be performance-wise under a variety of conditions? Up here in the Northeast or out there in the Pacific Northwest, where many times you're preparing surfaces in hostile weather environments, right? I think understanding how your surface will dry in many cases, or the opposite, how it will hold water so you're not constantly chasing. These are the things that we should be intuitively using to then calibrate with numbers that we can get and try to explain in other ways, right? I think golf course superintendents have an enormous amount of intuition about things when they let themselves have it. And then if they can marry that with the appropriate data that's easy to collect and then actionable, I think we'll be more sustainable in the drop of a hat if we get to a place where that's the way we operate.
Yeah, it's shocking, some of the numbers about how efficient people are when they implement this completely.
Yeah.
And people are mowing so infrequently, putting so little sand, putting so little nitrogen, not having spikes in disease, reducing fungicides, and the surface conditions that they're producing are amazing. And I hear this not from research that's being done at universities, but I hear this from cutting edge superintendents who are implementing so many of these techniques, that they're combining intuition with really observation of the grass and applying application of the measurements that they're taking, such as OM246, and doing common sense fertilization like MLSN to just put it on cruise control. Let's talk about this post really quick.
All right,
This is one that I'm going to put a direct link to in the show notes. It is a question that was sent to me. Do you have an idea why they recommend so much K? And the they was referring to soil consultants and consulting agronomists. And this let me just read a couple quotes from this post to put it in context. So this said, a correspondent wrote to me recently asking about recommendations for a lot more of an element than I would recommend. This was specifically for potassium. And I would have made a recommendation for about 4 grams of potassium per square meter because they shared the soil test results with me. So I would have recommended in 2024 growing season, I would have recommended 4 grams of potassium per square meter. That's 0.8 pounds of potassium per 1,000 square feet. So I would have recommended some, but not a lot. The actual recommendation they got was for 10 times that amount, 40 grams or 8 pounds. So rather than about 1 pound, I was recommending a little bit less than 1 pound. That's what I would have recommended based on the soil test result. They actually got recommended 8 pounds. That was from the soil test consultant. And then there was another agronomist who went there who evaluated the situation and affirmed that potassium application of that amount would be very important in achieving the desired conditions. And so the question that was posed to me, which was from another agronomist, was, why do golf consultants recommend so much more K than you do? And that's 1,000% more. And I responded like this. I said, I think the people making those recommendations fail to understand that the K they are recommending, or the nutrients they are recommending, are more than the grass can use. I don't know why they make those recommendations. I would not recommend that much potassium. That's how I responded. And I mentioned earlier that it's kind of like getting punched in the face with that, because I don't, it's not common in Japan, for example, to get that kind of crazy recommendation. I know, like, there's some places in the world where the recommendations would be more reasonable, maybe not as precise as the recommendations that I want to make, but not 1,000% more. And because we did this 20 years ago, Frank, I mean, we'd already finished that experiment 21 years ago. Why does this stuff persist? And just what are your thoughts on that? Again, how? Because I answer that, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why people do that.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that, when you came to work with me and we initially spoke about what we thought you had intended to work with me on, and I had an assistantship, and, I was totally game for this thing. I was like, yeah, well, I don't know. This sounds like something Marty should do, but, I'm not trained as a soil scientist. I'm not trained as a plant nutrition expert. As we talked about earlier, I'm a plant anatomist, physiologist, ecologist with some soil physics in my background. So I understand how plant and soil systems work. But I was never really trained in nutrition. I can remember a fertilizer class, but it didn't really make a big impression on me. And when I started managing golf courses, Micah, we would put in like a bag of Plant Marvel 2020 or some stupid thing like that, and go out like, once every 3 weeks on the putting greens back in the, in the mid 80s. So, when you came around, like, man, I had already started asking myself, because I started to see these recommendations as a state extension specialist, why people were recommending so much potassium when they were applying it. So you hit me at a time where I was asking these questions, but didn't really understand it either because I wasn't trained in it. But here's what I learned. What I learned is you look in every single textbook, except maybe Caro and Riki, and you see the pretty standard recommendations that you and I think, are confronting on a regular basis, that are essentially still based on this, work at Penn State in the late 70s that might have been adapted along the way minorly. But, you look at Mehlich 3 recommendations that are threefold greater than what you and I know the MLSN can be used to do. So why do people keep doing it? One is there still exists a pretty strong emphasis on sufficiency levels that, as you mentioned, are unreasonable. I think for us, especially me, not trained in plant nutrition per se, I looked at what you looked at. I was like, man, this doesn't make any sense. And of course, when we sat around and first talked about this, we were like, oh my gosh, we're not even testing the sands right. I mean, when you started working with Querine back then, it was like, oh man, this is going to turn into a analytical soil chemistry project, not even a how much K do you use project, because we really weren't confident we could set a baseline with the kinds of sands we had that were saturated with calcium, high pH, whether we could get a reasonable K recommendation. So here's the question I want to talk to you about, because I think there's two things. One is there's this existing dogma that we can't break through. There's this sort of general recognition that, what does it hurt or things like that. And then if you listen to my episode with Chaz in Oregon, right, the homeland for you, my sort of adopted, I want to be from Oregon sort of thing, he will disagree with me, maybe you, but me in the podcast about how much K POA needs, how much wear tolerance of bent grass. He has a different view on this from his work at Rutgers with POA and now in the Pacific Northwest with POA. So for me, I think it's still a bit murky because there's these exceptions like what Chaz seems to be finding. But at the same time, when I pressed Chaz on it, at 55 part per million, I think he says, something like that, was his MLSM, was the value where anthracnose isn't a problem with POA, something like that.
And Frank, so this is where I think Chaz has 2 emails in his inbox over the past 6 months inviting him for a follow-up episode with me where we're going to talk about potassium. Okay. And I was glad. I enjoyed listening to the episode with him on your show.
He was a tough get. He's like tougher than Obama to get.
He's really busy. He's really busy. And yeah, I think, yeah, there is a little bit of disagreement about potassium between he and I think, and I would like to discuss that for an hour with him. And I think it would be very interesting. But here's the thing that I want to point out that I think a lot of people never do. The difference between 37 parts per million and 55 parts per million or 50 parts per million is 0.2 of a pound, basically. Or it's 0.4 of a pound. It's something like that. Okay. Yeah, it's negligible. So generally for turf in a sand root zone, I'm often going to be making a recommendation for, remember that the blog post, I was recommending 0.8 pounds. So I'm often making a recommendation that is going to, I also think the way that they did their research, it's very difficult for them to pick a minimum number because what they found was the lowest amount of potassium they applied gave 100% of the benefit. So the question is, what if they would have applied half that rate? Clearly they had a potassium deficiency. The question is, did they properly identify what the really minimum amount requirement is? I don't know that their experiment was set up to do that, but the point is we're talking about nothing. We're talking about a negligible difference.
Right.
And people, I had a phone call yesterday with a graduate student who asked me a question about how to calculate the difference between what's in the soil and what the rate would be applied over the surface. So basically we're talking about the conversion of parts per million in the soil to pounds per thousand across the surface. People don't know how to do that. This was with a graduate student. People don't get taught that in their undergraduate. And I don't know that the way that Chaz did that, if they're really making that conversion between what the difference is between the soil level and the fertilizer rate level. If you do that, they're interchangeable because we know what the bulk density of the soil is and we know what the root zone depth is. That it's interchangeable. I have been forced to make these calculations myself to try to figure this out. And I sometimes wonder, why are people going out there saying that there's a difference when to me it's a negligible difference.
And I couldn't agree more with you. And I said ... that number used to be 150 part per million. that we would put on 20 pounds of K a year, and we couldn't figure out why we could never get to the sufficiency level. It's a fertilizer salesman's dream. I mean,
It's
this was the best thing ever invented, was potassium fertilization. And, this emanates from some work done, suspicious work done that we might have questions about from the 70s, from very reputable people, that's become ingrained in a way that's, in many ways, as we started this conversation, recalcitrant, so to speak. It simply will not break down.
I've got 4 quotes from emails that I've received. I'm going to read excerpts from those, and then we'll put this subject to rest, talk about a couple other fun things. This one came this morning from one of my soil testing clients, and this is a golf course superintendent in the U.S. with bent grass greens in the transition zone, and in a very hot part of the transition zone, and he rated his surfaces as excellent. And he sent me this. He said, at the end of this year, your recommendations have helped us produce some great putting surfaces. The icing on the cake is we only spent $223 on fertilizer for our greens this year. In fact, we only spent $4,107 fertilizing the entire 100 acres on our golf course. It is simply amazing to me. This is a quote. This is a quote from the email. It is simply amazing to me how much money is wasted on fertilizer in our industry. And I know, like, a lot of people are going to say money's not an issue. They're paid to produce results, but this guy is producing results. So it's the problem is there's illogic. I'm more concerned with the illogical over application of fertilizer. Here's another quote. This is from the Midwest, a superintendent in the Midwest. Local supers and sales guys that play my course think I'm crazy for only applying sand once a year and melting down urea or ammonium sulfate. Clipvol, Turf GVX, OM246, etc. are game changers. I wish more of this was taught at seminars in my area. Well, here's an opportunity. Come to my seminar at GCSA conference in San Diego, or come up to Niagara Falls for the Canadian conference where I'll also be talking about this kind of stuff. And then, a couple more. These are all from different superintendents. This is one from a superintendent also in the Midwest. He said, I rarely bump up against someone in my region that is remotely close to or aware of this type of turf management. I feel like I'm on an island and a pioneer for rethinking the way we do things. And then this one is from somebody in the in the sports turf industry. Micah, also in the USA. Micah, hoping you can offer some insight into why our soils guy is making these suggestions, especially as it relates to the cations. I've always tried to follow MLSN that you and Larry came up with, but it seems people still focus on the base saturation and getting the ratios right. I don't understand this. It's so confusing. 50 pounds of calcium per 1,000. I do not understand. Can you offer some insight? But the insight I offered was maybe get a different soils guy. But this stuff it's really persistent because all those emails came. One of them was this morning, but they all came in the time since we started trying to schedule this episode. And I kept saying, well, here's a quote I'll read to Frank. Here's something I can mention to him. And I'm just like, man, this is persistent. And maybe a younger generation like Chase Scrubus, who works with you. I talked with him at the U.S. Amateur at Hazeltine, and he's a big advocate for MLSN. He finds it really useful in the work that he does with the New York State parks. And yet he didn't find out about it till he came to Cornell. Here's a guy with a bachelor's degree from Penn State that's done internships and also used to be an assistant superintendent. How in all the seminars he went to, in all of the turf classes, in all of that excellent education that they get at Penn State, how does he not? And I understand I screwed off I'm not saying that Chase screwed off in school. He doesn't come across to me as the type of person who would.
Tim Putnam. We can ask Tim about you screwing off when we get a chance.
We can ask Tim about that. But yeah, I can understand how I would have missed some things in school. Chase doesn't seem like he would be the guy who would miss some things in school. But when you're an assistant superintendent, I think you tend to pay attention to what's going on. How do you not be aware of MLSN until you get to working for Frank at Cornell in 2024? I mean, it's a bit of a surprise to me. And what an
I
opportunity
tell
we
you,
have to get this
hey,
good information out.
well, and here's the thing, you know, I'll give you some. I remember when Bill Kreiser and I think we had dinner maybe a year ago, 18 months ago or something. And he goes, Frank, I still go places where guys don't know, have never heard of using growing degree days for PGRF. I think he did. I mean, it's not 20 years like the work we did, but it's certain if it's 15, it's got to be at least 15. He was doing it when he was in high school, and then came to work for Cuso back when he was an undergrad. So it. I can't explain why the approaches that we've always espoused about being more efficient, looking at your resources and scrutinizing and critically thinking through the way you use them. And in my case, it was nutrients and pesticides. We didn't do a lot of work with water. We didn't do a lot of work with organic matter and sand stuff. So that stuff's been changing. But what I like to that I can't. There's two things going on. One is they only hear you a little bit. They only see you a little bit. They only interact with you a little bit. I can tell you, I get weekly emails from the Northeast Harrells group that regularly tries to sell me and tell me and scare me into buying. Scaring is the best tactic ever. We got guys spraying for Pythium root rot in upstate New York in late February, early March, because they've been so told, you got to get that Pythium root rot material down now. So, don't feel like what you're up against, you're alone, that this is the only thing that people are sort of not accepting. And it's partially because the sort of routine, repetitive messages are, you need this, you learn this in school, you have to have this, it's a sale, it's EOP, it's biostimulants, it's that edge, it's that silver bullet. And for whatever reason, we have an industry wholly susceptible to that approach. But they run a national conference selling things. They run regional conferences selling things that are important to running an industry. And I think it will always be viewed as swimming against the tide to a certain extent, because at the top of this industry are the 20% highest budgets in the world, right? They're not paid to save money. They're not paid to be more efficient. If they've got a formula that employs 28 guys and they have the money to do it and no one's questioning the way they do it, why would they even be intrinsically motivated to try to learn a different way of doing if what they're doing is working?
Yeah, I've heard that argument, and I don't have a really strong rebuttal to that argument. The one rebuttal that I do have is, I think it could work even better if they're paid to produce conditions. I think you can have healthier grass, and I think you can have more resilient surfaces, and I think you can have surfaces that are prepared to a higher standard for more days in the year if you take a modern approach to greenkeeping rather than this works and we're going to keep doing it and we're going to throw more resources at it. And I can't prove that, but I do work with some high-end places also, and they report back to me like they thought it was really good and now they made it better. and
Right.
So,
and a lot of times, here's the thing, and I think this is what Chris talks about a lot, Trittabaugh talks about a lot, that I like. And I got into quite a bit of a bantering match with a bunch of Met superintendents at Fenway Golf Club this past fall. I got to run an outside little workshop with our golf shoe work. and I brought up the idea of not disrupting golf that much, right? And Chris's idea of how many good days of golf are they getting. And so a lot of times I like what you're saying, that they can be better. Some people can't imagine. They're like, well, I don't really want to get them any faster, or they're smooth enough. But if you looked at better as more days of really good golf that you're offering your membership, and not, messing up the surface by poking holes like crazy and burying them in sand, 20 times a year like we used to recommend. And then the fear, if you stop doing that, they're going to get set back. So here's something I'll tell you. I get with these guys, and I said exactly what you and I are talking about. Why can't we do it less? Why can't we try to find numbers that'll work? Why can't we disrupt it less? Golfers are complaining about this. Why don't we give them what we want, right? And I just got them trained. I don't want to change it. It's working. That was a good one. But the other one was, well, I tried that and I fell behind, or I took a step back. And I'm thinking, whoa, did you change anything else? No. I was like, wait a minute. So you told me you're not going to cultivate, not going to throw as much sand and disrupt, but you're not going to change the way you do anything else? No. Well, then you got exactly what you should have expected. If you don't drive down your nutrient use, or your growth, and you don't add sand or cultivate, of course it's going to take a step back. They didn't even consider maybe they should adjust other parts of their program. And that's the thing that concerns me the most, is the inability to critically think, because we turned their university education and all their education into job preparation, professional development, instead of critical thinking.
I've got a question about industry and what you just said. Is this industry a trade, or is it a profession?
I honestly can't say. I'd have to ask Claude, my AI tool, what the distinction between those things are. But here's what I believe. I believe there's a craft to what we do that inherently, for many people, is an ingrained skill. I've watched superintendents inherently know and adopt a very progressive management system that they probably weren't that educated on. It just made common sense to them. And I see a lot of uneducated people run really good golf courses, not at the highest level, but certainly at a level that's acceptable for the clientele they're shooting at, which implies to me that it's a bit of a craft and a skill, like a plumber, an electrician,
Like a
that
trade.
sort of, like a trade. I do think there's a tradesmanship to it. That said, I believe the thing that differentiates it are the externalities, the potential impact that these things can have on the broader environment, right? I think we're releasing nutrients, we're consuming water, we're releasing pesticides into the environment. And I think we need to be educated as stewards. And that's where we move from a trade craft to a profession, where I think it needs to have some STEM knowledge that maybe a trade doesn't need.
And STEM, that is an acronym for science,
technology, engineering, and math.
Yes, and I've had a turf math series with Bjarne Hannesson, who I think your background image is that Grindavik.
Yes, it is. I was there, a couple of months after the volcano when we went in March.
So you're showing
that place makes an impression on you.
So the North Atlantic Plate and the Atlantic Plate, if that's what they're called, they go right through that golf course. so you can play one hole from Europe to Asia, and the geology is just right there, and you can see it's splitting apart right in the image behind Frank. That is a cool place. Yeah. But I've had a series with Bjarne and with Jason Haynes about turf math. And I know Jason, when he was sharing his spreadsheets and sharing the great results that he was getting by applying some numbers to turf management. And a lot of people struggle to do that. The math training, people learn it and then they go out and work and they do the trade aspect, the raking a bunker perfectly, doing drainage where the water goes downhill. and changing the whole location and putting it in the right spot and fixing that perfectly and aligning the tee markers and mowing without damaging the grass when you turn, and all of the trade craft, working with the team, getting the job done in the allotted amount of time, dealing with members, all of the trade craft. And then they suddenly realize they don't know how to calculate the surface area impacted by tines. If you look at the TurfNet forum, one of the common questions that comes up is, can somebody share with me that surface disruption calculator from Istric or from Dryject or whatever? All right, Frank, we've been talking a long time. I'll ask you one thing. This has been so interesting and useful for me to have this advice from a mentor and somebody who's so experienced with this type of stuff. I'll give you an opportunity, if you'd like, to correct yourself about the importance of smoothness from that rather disturbing conversation we had. I'll put a link to the video also in the show notes. Frank and I met in August at the U.S. Amateur at Hazeltine National, and we thought, let's have a fun, good-natured conversation, and let's talk about something important like the quality of ball roll on putting greens. And then you astounded me, you shocked me, and you disappointed me. And I think you were talking about a smoothness measurement, and I was talking about smoothness. And I think smoothness is important, and you're saying it's not if you don't even know what the numbers mean. And would you like to clarify and correct yourself? Because I'm sure you've watched that and said, I didn't make much sense, did I? Or are you going to double down? Are you going to double down?
Well, I guess according to you, I didn't make any sense. But I can tell you, I got quite a few emails after that of people that were like, I agree with you 100% about how do you interpret this and make sense of it. Of course, listen. This was good television, as we would say, right? We were doing. Do I think golfers prefer or don't care about bumpy surfaces versus smooth surfaces? Of course, that's not what we were talking about. What we were talking about in many ways is the way we've begun to imagine redefining smoothness, right? Right. I mean, I don't think you're exactly right. We're not differing on the value of a smooth putting surface, a true putting surface, the value of it as a measure of your performance of the surface. But what we're talking about is, the granularity with which we've begun to try and measure this.
And so you were basically saying that measuring smoothness is not useful for a golf course superintendent. And then you tried to say, like, how do you communicate it to the golfer? I don't know why would you ever communicate it to the golfer? The point is, you're as a superintendent, you're trying to make the greens as smooth as possible. So why doesn't it makes sense to measure how smooth they are and then make them smoother and evaluate whether that sand top dressing dusting application that you're doing in the purpose of maintaining smoothness, is that really making it smoother or is it not? Is the venting that you're doing for the purpose of whatever, how much does that disrupt the smoothness? And I think that it makes sense to use the bobble test, for example, which is a rapid visual test of how smooth the roll is across the surface. How is something like that not useful to a turfgrass manager? And I never want to communicate that to a golfer, but yeah. I think it's so useful. And we had that really fun conversation. It's a terrific, good television, but I thought, and you were saying, well, we don't know how to interpret the numbers. I don't know. I mean, for bobble tests, even you can interpret the numbers, right?
That's right. Okay. Let's go back to, again, what we're talking about here. And this came up because of the discussion with regard to the what we were watching, what I was watching superintendents do, skipping mowing, making smoothness with the GS3, trueness with the GS3, the way it was being measured, making decisions that I thought, at least in my mind, were probably not accurate decisions. They might be if the particular type of smoothness mattered. Now, since we've talked, let me say the following. I'm growing more and more comfortable with at least understanding how to interpret whether it's your bobble test or it's the GS3 device, because now I'm getting some ranges of what people tell me is acceptable, unacceptable, or unacceptable, acceptable, exceptional. When someone can start to tell me what unacceptable, acceptable, and exceptional is, right? In a way that allows me, like you said earlier, right? A snapshot of smoothness by itself, like a snapshot of OM246 by itself, might not be useful. But looking at that trend over time and filling in that time with the practices that you use, right? That's exactly what I would tell people to do. I honestly don't care how you go about get those damn measurements, but if you can then correlate it to your practices, your results, your resilience, right? Okay, all of a sudden you get 3 days of 240 rounds a day. They didn't hold up very good. Okay, now I gotta reconsider how I'm going into that kind of an event. I may need a little bit more thatch, or I might not want to put that sand. I don't want to presume what decisions we make, but I do know this. We don't know what decisions to make many times to remedy some of these problems. Yes, rolling, yes, lowering, mowing, yes, maybe dusting, but I think that's where the craft comes in to a certain extent, to
And
figure out how to deliver on those numbers, right? And that's those practices in between the numbers that we measure for smoothness. So I hope that clarifies and redeems me from being embarrassed for arguing a point about smoothness that at the moment I was very confused about the way we want to talk about this and take action around this, whether it's with golfers or in our own
yeah,
programs.
I certainly don't want to talk to golfers about it, but I find it so useful for a superintendent. If you're getting complaints that the greens are bumpy in the afternoon, how is it not useful to have a score of what the smoothness is? And you say, you know what? Let me top dress more. That's supposed to help. Increase the growth regulation. Let's get less leaves there to get scuffed up. And if you can score it, if you can measure it, then you can adjust it, and then you can check, you know what? Top dressing worked. Rolling didn't work. It didn't matter if we rolled in the morning or not. You can learn these things. And
Okay.
for
So let
your
me ask
site.
you a question, though. Let me ask you a question. Because up until recently, right? I mean, this whole idea, you know, I have been talking about smoothness for 15 years with the various devices that have been out and about trying to figure this out. Because my assumption was the following, Micah. If things were really not smooth or true, right? Wouldn't that be reflected in a change in speed? Wouldn't you think dissipating energy in any way that the energy is dissipated? At least I intuitively thought that when we started to explore the topic of smoothness and trueness back, in the Sphero days, back in the perimeter days. We even tried to do it when we did our mowing work. Brett Welch and team used to count uncut leaves that would be found after a mowing event. Based on frequency of clip and other work we were doing back in the day. You might have been around for some of that, or might have been right before
I
you.
was
Anyway,
yeah,
yeah.
not.
So there's a part of me that said, Micah, 15 years ago when we just rolled the ball on a stimp meter and we got a speed and we watched that ball roll, didn't we instinctively say, that's a good true roll? I mean, we sort of said that to ourselves. We didn't benchmark it, but there was an intuition that it was an adequate green. Or it was like, whoa, did you see that? Or, you notice a hop or a snake.
I
So I wonder about it. I worry about, are we getting too worried about analyzing some of these surfaces to the point where we're making tweaks that, might not be meaningful to the average golfer or add to the day's usefulness or resilience or anything like that?
I agree. Although, as I've made more and more stimp meter measurements, I've made tens of thousands of stimp meter measurements now in my life. on surfaces of, from Serangoon grass to I probably measured stimp meter on more zoysia greens than anybody in the world. I'm pretty sure. And bent grass under tournament conditions, bent grass not under tournament conditions, POA, etc. I've noticed some things where it's useful to deliberately pay attention to the roll and not only to the distance. And I thought the same as you. I thought that if we achieve the speed, in order to achieve the speed, it's just inherently going to have acceptable smoothness there, and it generally does. It generally does. But as people keep pushing to have surfaces that are better and better and better, and you can have a little bit of wobbling, and I've noticed this. When you put a lot of growth regulation and you cut the nutrients and you make it dry for a tournament, those old aerification holes, they start to show up. And if you get and you roll the ball on a really fast green and you look at the end of the roll, you can see the ball moving, and that's not a true roll. And the green speed could be exceptional. And yet I'm going to look at that and go, man, I don't want to see that close up on television. I sure would hate to see that ball close up on television, because all the superintendents are going to be looking and golfers are going to be saying, what happened to that ball? Why did it do that? And as we keep trying to make the surfaces better and better, why doesn't it make sense to measure that, to put a score to that and try to make it better?
Well, you walked into something there at the very end when you started to say, as the ball started to slow down, right? And that moment, the moment of the energy moment where the deceleration starts to occur, right? The degradation of the roll is actively occurring, right? Where it's more susceptible as it's losing energy to deflection. And of course, we've studied this quite a bit in the last 8 years with our FootJoy golf shoe work. And now, we're using some machine learning to do some better ideas of predicting. We've got Maggie helping us with some of this. We're presenting a technical paper at the international meeting in Japan about using machine learning to try to predict responses to ball roll and shoes. And so all I want to say from my end on this is the following. There is no question about the fact that as we get to 13, 14, 15 feet green speeds, like we saw at our Cola Country Club this past year in our golf shoe work with the Met superintendents, there's no doubt about it. In the early phases of that roll, that thing is dead true. But as it starts to decelerate near the hole, and in fact, faster greens, the speed is slower, right? Because it rolls less and it takes longer to come to a complete stop than a slow green, right? So it's more susceptible. And my question remains, as you just said, yes, I don't like seeing it, but I don't know that there's a damn thing I can do about it. If I'm going to have those speeds and people are going to wear those shoes and I'm going to do the things I'm doing, I think tweaking it at that level can get you into a little bit of analysis paralysis. And I just want to be clear, we're not going down that hole. I'm still questioning the overall value of this measurement. Yes. Yeah. And I'll stay questioning it. I don't say it's not important. I'm just questioning the value that it has, particularly in the high performance situations that you're describing.
Okay. And I'm going to share in the show notes a couple of videos or blog posts that I have on this topic about different ways to measure smoothness. I like the bobble test because it's something we can see with our eyes. We don't need machine learning. We don't need an app. We just look at it with our eyes and we give it a score if that was perfect or it was not perfect, basically. And then once it's not perfect, we're scoring how many imperfections we saw, basically. And I think that that's useful. I think you would have to be a special kind of person to get into that analysis so much that it would be a problem, that it would be a distraction. Because basically you can just say, we can watch on TV and see at the Masters, there's a little bit of of strange movement at the end. We can watch at the U.S. Open. There's a bit of movement at the end. We watch at many tournaments where the pros are very happy with the surfaces, and everybody's happy with the surfaces, and it's not perfect. It's never perfect, but sometimes at our own golf course or at a course we go to play, we could see all kinds of imperfections. And the question is, how do we make it closer to something that has fewer imperfections? And I used to think that, so my final statement is, I used to think Stimpmeter was enough. If we want to actually make it better, we should measure smoothness also. But I prefer bobble test because the number is meaningful to me.
And so I'm not going to disagree with you, but here's what I think is important for people listening to this is all of these things are contextual. You have to make sense of them for your surfaces, right? And I feel like the ultimate goal is to find, in sports, they call it a safety envelope, where you've got a number of measurements that you want them to be in particular ranges for you to feel like it's a safe surface. So I would like a collection of performance measurements, which of course many people have, you have. And I would like to say, if I'm in the ranges of all these things, I'm good. I got a program that's dialed in. Now, one could say, well, was it resilient? Could I go less? Should I question it more? I feel like smoothness is one of the several things that I want to be aware of on a routine basis that are helping me determine if I'm in the envelope for the high performance surfaces I'm charged with producing.
Awesome.
That's sort of what I want.
I was at a seminar with Warren Scott, the grounds manager for Liverpool Football Club. He came over to Bangkok a couple of weeks ago. It was just fascinating to hear at a club like that, the ranges, because he was talking about data and talking about what the standards are, what they want for soil moisture content for a game day, for not a game day, what they want for firmness, what they want for how much growth, how much nutrients in the leaves.
They got 2 acres. What do they got? 2.5 acres?
Well, they've got a lot of practice. They got a lot of practice fields, but then they have different construction. It's really fascinating because they'll have different hybrid construction. Some of the practice fields don't have any stitching, don't have any hybrid. So,
they all have to play the same. Like we make a real effort here at Cornell. Chris Sitko, our sports and golf director, works, he's got a rye POA surface and a rye bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass surface. And we measure a lot to make sure they play the same. And I'll tell you, in sports, top dressing is the key. Top dressing and rolling and wetting those surfaces so the surface is slick. You get that ball skidding. I think the work Sorokin's doing is so cool. I think that FIFA work is really cool.
That is really cool. We're going to hear all about it in the upcoming couple of years.
Yes.
Right. So I think we'll be hearing a lot more about that. And that's good. All right, Frank, thank you so much for your insight. I really appreciate it. It has been great to have you on the show. Anything else before we sign off?
It's always great to see you. Thanks for having me.
All right, Frank.
February.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. I'll sign off now. Thanks for listening. For ATC from Trong, Thailand, I'm Michael Woods.